Welcome everybody to the third quarter 2018 Society of Piping Engineers and Designers quarterly meeting. Today we have the opportunity to have Hagerman and Company do a presentation on Navisworks. SPED in a quick nutshell is dedicated to the training, evaluation, certification, piping engineers and designers in the process industries. I'll reach out to you through your contact information for more SPED information, but right now I'll turn it over to Tony and Brett with Hagerman for Navisworks presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time today. According to Casey, you've asked for a few topics to be covered in Navisworks. So I figured you might be ready to get right into them. So let's get going. So here are the topics that I was asked to cover today. We had someone ask about basic moving of objects using the gizmo. I'm also going to cover how to move objects based on distance. And while I'm at it, I'll also cover how to move an object from point to point using snaps. Yes, Navisworks does have snaps. Also give you a brief introduction to the quantification tool or quantity takeoff. And we also had a question about exporting a Navisworks model to Google Earth. So we will talk about that. And also how to view a Navisworks model online or in VR goggles if you happen to own a pair of those. So this last one here, the topic of VR, I might not be able to demo this topic live during the webcast since you can't see me and my goggles. So if that's the case, I will discuss that as much as I can and hopefully point you in the right direction. This should take me between 30 and 45 minutes to cover these. Afterward, depending on how well we can hear each other, I do plan on opening the floor for questions, but I would like to ask you to hold them until the end, if that's okay. All right, so let's get into Navisworks. Here's what we're looking at. We've just got 3 files here that we're going to use for our examples here today. And the first topic up is working with the gizmo. So we'll do that first. Now, whenever you select elements in Navisworks, you do have a handful of ways to select. You can select things by layer, you can select individually, entire files, and so on. And so here we'll just select something like this column here. And then I'm going to go over to the item tools. That tab in the ribbon only shows itself when you have objects selected. So that's the first thing. Then we're going to turn on the move tool. And if you can't see the gizmo, depending on how you're zoomed, you may need to zoom out a little bit. So that's the first thing that I catch myself doing is just working with the gizmo itself. So for example, if I wanted to be zoomed in a little closer, I can't see the gizmo. I've known people that get hung up on that at first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom out until I do see it. This is such a long object. The gizmo, by default, will go to the center of the objects that you have selected. But I'm going to move the gizmo. So instead of moving this column first, I'm going to move the gizmo. And you can do that by holding down the control key, and then you can click and hold on the ball that's at the center of the gizmo. And that will allow you to reposition the gizmo. That way, if you need to zoom in like I'm going to do here, and you need to be in close, then you can have the gizmo on screen. Now, I will point out here that if I deselect this object and then select it again, that gizmo is going to go back home. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to make sure I keep that selected, and then if I want to drag that around, I can. Now, based on the question that I got about how to move things with the gizmo, you may already be familiar with this. This is freehand moving in the X, Y, and Z axes just by clicking and dragging on each of the colored axes. But I have no idea how far I'm moving it, so it's all estimated, right? This you may already be familiar with, but next I'm going to show you how to move things a particular distance.
Thank you.
Now, before I do that, if you want to set this object back to its original location, you can click on Reset Transform from the ribbon, and it puts it back to where it was before you moved it. You could also right-click on it and go to Reset Item and then Reset Transform. That's another way you could do that.
Really?
Okay. So next, what I'm going to do next is move some objects based on a distance. And what I'm going to move are the elements that I have in here from Plant 3D. See, I've got a structure file and equipment and piping, and I can't select those the way I was selecting the column. So I'm going to use the selection tree for this one. And I'm just going to select those two files there. Those are the two that I brought in from Plant 3D.
Oh, got the good stuff.
So I'm going to get those selected first.
All the same, or they
And then
mild, medium, and hot. Oh.
we got some background chatter there. Whoever is talking, would you mind muting yourself? Thanks, appreciate that. Okay, so first thing I want to do before we start this move is I'm going to select my objects again. So I'm going to select both those files. Then what you'll do is go over to the Review tab. Because in the Navisworks model, I don't yet know how far things are from each other. So I'm going to go to Review and do a point-to-point measure. And all I want to know right now is the distance between the face of this column and the face of this footing pad. So I'm going to pretend that I'm going to move the plant elements and line them up with that column. So I'm going to measure from one face to the other face. And that's going to give you the X, Y, and Z distances along with the distance between the 2 points that you pick. So you get 4 measurements in one in Navisworks. And the one I'm interested in is the Y direction. So I'm going to move the plant elements to line those up, and the distance I want to move is 3 feet 9 inches. I'm just going to clear that measurement there. Since I already have my objects selected, now I can go back to Item Tools. I still have Move turned on. And then you're going to go to the Transform Flyout. Anytime you see a triangle that's on one of the panels, there's additional tools in there. So I'm going to expand that, and this is where the position tools are in Navisworks. I want to move in the Y direction. So what I'm going to do is replace those zeros right there with 3 feet 9. Now, before I press enter, I want to point something out here. If you're used to working in any of the AutoCAD products or even any of the others, you might be used to using the feet symbol and the inch symbol. Navisworks prefers FT and IN. So just keep that in mind. And what I do when I'm in Navisworks is I just steer clear of those and just replace the digits whenever I'm in here. Feet and inches still work, you know, the symbols. But once in a while, it is possible to fat finger and then something doesn't move where you want it to and you have to repeat it. So I prefer to just replace the numbers and leave the feet and the inch indicators alone. So I'll go ahead and enter that. Move those objects. And I'm also the paranoid type. I like to verify that that is in fact lined up. So I'll go back to the Review tab and take another measurement real quick between those two faces and verify that my Y is now 0 feet 0 inches. Also, if you don't like using the ribbon, there is an alternative. Let me clear that measurement there. You can also right-click on your objects and go to Override Item and Override Transform. When you use this method, it's a little more slimmed-down view that you're looking at. I think there's a lot of information in the drop-down that's up in Item Tools. This way, I'm just looking at what I need to move that object. And then, of course, if I want to reset that item, I can do that with the Reset Transform. and put that back in its original location. So that's how you move items with a distance. The third way to move an item is from point to point using these snaps. So let's look at that. So here I'll move this footing pad, and I'll just pretend I need to snap it to the corner of this column here. So again, we're going to rely on the review tools for that. So first you'll select your objects. This time I'm not going to go to item tools to do the move. I'm going to go to measure first, and I'm going to do another point-to-point measure. This time I'm not going to select on the face though. I'm going to select on the corner. And as soon as you get to that corner, the endpoint snap will take over. So there's your snaps in Navisworks. They are there. So I'll pick right there. I'll pick on this corner here. And you might have to take your time. Sometimes if you're in Navisworks, you want to make sure you're close. I think they're a little sensitive on invoking those snaps. So it doesn't hurt for me to slow down just a little bit and make sure that I get that point. Once you have those 2 points, again, this is what's different about Navisworks. Most of us would think I'm moving something. I'm going to go to item tools and go to move, but not in this case. When you're doing a point-to-point move, you're going to do it all from the review tab. So you take your measure, then you drop down the measure panel and choose transform selected items. And when you do that, your object will be moved from point A to point B based on that measurement. All right, so there you have your 3 ways to move objects. You've got the gizmo for doing freehand moves. You can move by distance using item tools in the transform panel here. And then for point-to-point moves, you take a measurement and then transform selected items. And then, of course, at any time, if you want to put something back where it came from, just right-click on it, reset item, and reset transform. Or you can do that from the ribbon as well. All right, so those are the 3 ways to move objects in Navisworks. I believe the next topic that was requested was quantity takeoff. So let's switch it to that. Just going to change my viewpoint here. And just from practicing for today, it looks like I still have my last one in here, so I might have to do some cleanup. But to start the quantification tool, you'll find that on the Home tab, on the Tools panel, in Quantification. And here's what the tool looks like. It does take up a bit of screen real estate for me today, so I might have to stretch it and shrink it quite a bit here so we can see everything. But this is what the panel looks like. We've got the quantification workbook, which is where the takeoff is going to live. And we've got 3 tabs down here. We've got the workbook tab, the item catalog tab, and the resource catalog tab. We also have the sheet browser right here. This comes up because if you happen to have 2D drawings that are in your Navisworks model, they would be listed here, and you could do takeoffs from 2D drawings as well. Since I don't have any in this model, I am just going to close the sheet browser, and we'll do everything from the model. Now it looks like I left behind what I was doing earlier, so I'm just going to delete these so that way we can start fresh. All right, so when you're working in the quantity takeoff, the first place you're going to go is the item catalog tab. This is where we go to set up our takeoff. When we want to do the takeoff, we do that from the workbook tab. So I'll be switching back and forth between these two. I could do this from scratch and set up my own takeoff, or I could import a catalog that has some structure to it for all the items that I'm going to take off. So first I'm going to do a little bit from scratch, and then I'll import a catalog that comes with Navisworks and show you that. So what I'm going to do is, first I'll make sure that this is empty. Okay. So from the item catalog, I'm going to set up a takeoff for some of the equipment that you see here. We'll do a takeoff with some of the piping, and then there's some pumps. They're out of view right now, but we're going to do a takeoff of those items too. So first thing you're going to do on the item catalog is you'll do a new group, and I'm going to make myself an equipment group. Underneath there, I'm going to do a new item. And the first item is going to be tanks. And I'll do an item for pumps. And an item for heat exchangers. Okay. And once you start creating these, we do have color capability. We can set up formulas if we need to track certain data. And whenever we start taking these items off, they'll receive new colors so that you can tell what's been taken off and what hasn't. So once we set those up, we'll also see them ready to use over in the workbook where we actually do the takeoff. Back on the item catalog, I'm going to create one more. I'm going to do another top level group for piping. And then underneath piping, I'm going to create a few items. We're going to base these off of size. So I'm going to make an item for 6-inch piping. And then I'll do one for 8-inch and 10-inch. Okay. And so that'll get me started. So here's going to be my workbook. I'm going to start with the tanks. So if all I want to do is start the takeoff, first thing I'll do is select that item in the workbook. Then I'm going to go out into the model and select those objects. So you'd select these 3 tanks here. Then you can right click on those and go to quantification. And then you'll choose takeoff to tanks. And this will vary right here. Since I chose tanks down in the workbook, that's why it's in the right mouse button now. So I'll choose that, and there's the 3 takeoffs right there. This object name here, that actually comes from Plant 3D. So it will read information from the source objects. Anybody who uses Plant 3 might recognize this object name. That's what it is in the database in Plant 3D. There's plenty of information that we can track in the takeoff window, but I want to point out that there is no information right now. So if anybody's ever seen this, you might have asked yourself, well, what good is it? If we got all these slides of information, but they're blank. That is simply because there are certain properties from certain products outside of Navisworks. Some properties will feed all the way from the source into the takeoff. Other properties we may have to map on our own, and then we can start tracking those. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. You know, from some products like Revit, you'll see a lot more data that's already filled in. The knot that's tied between a product like Revit and Navisworks is very tight. It's very integrated. From the AutoCAD products, not so much. Now, this data is in the model. It's just not making its way to the takeoff. So, and you'll see that in an example I've got coming up. For now, what I'm going to do is just pretend I want to track the weight of all my equipment. So down here in the takeoff window, I'll select on the takeoff and I'll enter the weight. You can do that manually. So right here, we can add data. So we do have full control over what's going into your takeoff. So I'll just pretend those tanks are 1,000 pounds each. In the window just above the takeoff window is where all of the calculations start happening. So you can see here right off the bat, I'm getting a total weight and it's a running total. So as I add and subtract takeoff information, that calculation will take care of itself. So there are some there is some math that is happening in the background automatically. Another one that happens automatically is the count. All right, so that's the tanks. Next, I'll do the heat exchanger. So I'll select that item in the workbook. Then I'll go out to the model and select the objects. Again, I'll right click, then quantification, and then take off to heat exchangers. And that adds that one. And then we can also see the count over on the left side of the screen as well. We'll go ahead and add a weight here. I'll pretend this one's 600 pounds. Okay, so that's how we can do takeoffs from the model. Now let's try and do a takeoff of something that doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to switch my view here. I got a view of my pumps here. The problem is the pumps aren't there, but I still want to do my takeoff, and I don't want to wait for a designer to add that to the model. I want to go ahead and account for those. So to do that, first I'll make sure I've got that item selected in the workbook, but instead of picking out here, since they don't exist, I'm going to do a virtual takeoff. I'm going to create it in pumps, and I'm going to do it 3 times. You can see right there, I've got those accounted for in the takeoff. They just don't have a name, doesn't know what kind of object they are because it's a virtual takeoff. And then once those items are actually in the model, then I can go back and do it the first way, which will account for all of the appropriate data that comes with those objects. Here, I'm just going to give them a rename just for my own sake. And I'm going to call this equipment missing or pump missing or something like that. I like to use the word missing when I'm doing this because that just tells anyone who's looking at this information that this was a virtual takeoff and not modeled. So we'll add that to the formula bar and have some information there. Now, as soon as I did that, a viewpoint was captured. Just like the viewpoints when you're viewing your model, normally in Navisworks, you can capture viewpoints of takeoff items. Now, another thing I'm going to do here is add a markup just to tell the rest of the team, make it a little more obvious that the pumps aren't there yet. So I'll go over to review, and I might draw a circle or a box or a cloud, whatever you want to use here. Maybe add some text and just tell the world someone needs to add the pumps, but it's still part of the takeoff. Now, since I've added that markup, I'll select each of the takeoff items down here. And on the workbook toolbar, we can add a viewpoint to the takeoff. So I'll pick each one of these and add a viewpoint. All I'm doing is updating what was already there. That way, if I happen to be out in the model somewhere else, I'll just change the view here. The markup's not visible. All I have to do is click on one of the viewpoints for one of these takeoffs, and that'll take you back to that view, and you can see the markup. So those tools are available to you from inside the quantity takeoff. All right. Next, I'm going to do some piping takeoff. This is going to be a little more involved because I don't want to have to go and pick pipe segments one at a time or anything like that. I have no idea how many segments there are. So I'm going to use a different method to select those. And what I like to use here is find items. Whenever there's too many to select, we can use find items. And just to save some time today, I did save my criteria for selecting my 8-inch pipe. So I'm going to go to import from find items. And I'm just going to choose my criteria that I called pipe 8. So this is piping that's 8 inches in size. And all that does is updates the settings right here in find items. I could do this manually, but I wanted to save some time today. So I'm just going to import that. Use Find All, and that's going to select all of the straight pipe that you see here. It's all in blue. You can also see it from the selection tree. Now this time, instead of right-clicking on the objects and adding them to the takeoff, I'll come down and do this one from the workbook. So now I'm going to right-click on my 8-inch piping item and choose Takeoff Selected Model Items. So you can do your takeoff from the workbook, or you could do it from the model objects, your choice. Now once I do that, now I've got my piping, and I'm also tracking the length. You can see that here. In addition to that, up here in my tally, there's my total length so far. So all my 8-inch pipe, that's the total linear footage of those pipe segments. So I've already got a running total on that. Now, I just use that example. I don't know if that would be useful to anyone here today, but it is nice to be able to extract information from models that come from Plant 3D or Smart Plant or the other products that you're using. I find this very useful. Now let me show you how I did that, because this here is not out of the box. When you first do it, that may not be there. Your links might be empty. So first, what you'll want to do is just select on one of your pipe segments, or whatever object has that property that you're after, and look at its properties. If it comes from an AutoCAD product, and Plant 3D in particular, go to the AutoCAD tab, and then you'll see the length properties. So the information is in the model. All we got to do is send it to the takeoff. So there it is. And when you first open properties, it might look more like this. If you can't see the AutoCAD tab right away, then use one of the arrows to step over until you do see it. So what we need to do is remember it's on the AutoCAD tab and whatever the name of that property is. Then go to the item catalog and go to property mapping. And I've already got this set up, but what you would do is, if I take this out, and I'll just add it again, so we can do it from scratch, then what you'll do is your takeoff property will be the property that's in the workbook. In this case, it's model length. You would choose that. Next, you'll choose the category. The category is the tab from the properties window, which is AutoCAD in this case, and then your property is length. Once you have that in place, when you conduct those takeoffs, any item that's from an AutoCAD file that has a length property, it will start tracking the length for you. Now, it won't update existing ones. So if you do a takeoff and realize the length isn't there, then it won't update ones that have already been taken off. So keep that in mind. What you'll have to do is delete those takeoff items and then take them off again after you add the property mapping. So be aware of that. So now I'm tracking some length, which is good. I've got some weight I'm tracking in here. And then if I needed to add a formula, if you're going to do cost, things like that with Navisworks, then we have enough information that we can then add a calculation. You can do that in Navisworks, or you can do it in Excel if you're more comfortable with that. So I've got my data taken off. The next step might be to share that data with someone who's not a Navisworks user, but they need the data. So on the far right end of the workbook toolbar is where all the import-export functions are. So from here, I can export the quantities to Excel. And this This is nice. This is such a simple feature, which I don't see very often, but from Navisworks, I can go ahead and open this file. I don't have to go diving into my computer to find where I saved that file. Such a simple feature. I wish more products would do something like that, but here it is in Excel, the entire takeoff. There's the weights, so those are being tracked. The links are somewhere else, but there are a lot of tabs, plenty of different ways for you to view this information as it comes out of Navisworks, and then you can hand this off to the appropriate people for that project. All right, so that's an example of creating your own takeoff from scratch. If you want to import a preset, you can do that from the import-export tools as well. And we can import a catalog. And the catalog will be made up of all of the groups and items that you would have created here on the item catalog tab. So to do an import, we'll go to import catalog. And these are the 3 catalogs that come with Navisworks. There's a couple of CSI formats, and then there's a unit format. I'll just pick one of these and open it. And what you'll get is a lot more groupings. And this can be done by you, or you could go with one of the out-of-the-box ones, depending on how you'd like to start. You know, this one here has got plenty of preset categories already. So if I were to take off the slab or the concrete that's in the walls, I already have an item for that. So I don't have to create all of these myself. So if you have a lot of items that you're going to take off, maybe you'll go this route. If you don't have that many, then maybe you'll do it from scratch, like I did my equipment and piping. We can also delete the ones we don't use. For example, I don't have any basement in this particular model, so I'll just delete that from the catalog. I might delete the shell stuff if I'm not going to take off anything for the building. You know, there's some interiors. That's a branch. I don't have any interior stuff, so I just delete it. We'll take out all the architectural stuff. You know, if you have plumbing, maybe you'll leave those. If you're doing HVAC takeoffs, maybe you'll leave that branch too, and just take out the ones. So you could start with a bigger catalog and then delete the groups that aren't important to you. Or you can create them yourself. It's up to you. I already have an equipment group that I set up, so I'd take that one out. And I find myself on these, I'm taking out more than I'm putting in. So, you know, why not just do it from scratch? So it just depends. All right. So that is a quick introduction to the quantification tool. I hope that's enough to get you going, or maybe clear some of the fog that you might have around that tool. Let me go ahead and turn that off. All right, and so the next topic, I believe, is goggles or VR. So let's talk about that. So when you want to set up to do online viewing, or if you want to share this with someone and they want to do the VR thing, there are some considerations that you're going to need to consider before you do that. First of all is going to be materials. Lots of objects that come from Plant 3D and Smart Plant, and especially Revit, materials have already been assigned. That's a good thing. That means you don't have to deal with those in Navisworks. But a lot of times they're not. So when you're working with Navisworks, it's possible that you're looking more at a shaded version of the model versus realistic. So I want to show you those tools. On the Viewpoint tab, on the Render Style panel, we do have different modes. Shaded mode is very common in Navisworks. So if it looks like that, then that means there might not be a lot of material applied to those objects, and that is possible. The full render version, if you just switch to that, then you'll be able to tell if things, look more realistic. You'll be able to tell. As you can see here, like the floor, I can tell it looks like there's material applied there already. So you wouldn't have to deal with that. So to keep this simple, what we want to do is look at or ask ourselves, what don't I have to work with here? Because we're not talking about full-blown rendering like an architect would do and things like that. We don't even want to have to scratch the surface, unless it's necessary. But I do want to show you these tools just in case. So there's already some material applied to some of the elements here. The steel, it looks gray, but maybe it's just a color, right? So on the Render tab, we'll go to Autodesk Rendering, and that will open up this window here, and that'll give you access to the material library. And it's the same library that Plant 3D has access to, all the other AutoCAD tool sets, and Revit. It's all the same, so that makes it easy to transfer between the two. So if you would happen to add material for piping in Plant 3D, it will transfer over to Navisworks and it will already be applied to those objects. But if you need to apply to something, so let's say if I'm going to apply some material to, or make sure there's material on piping, then first I'll select those objects, and I'll just pick a few here. Or maybe I'll come over and change the selection method to layer, and that'll allow me to pick entire pipe runs. Maybe I'll do that. So I'll pick these here. And let's say I want to make sure that those are stainless steel, and they look like stainless steel when I share this view with someone. So I'll come into the material window and just right click and choose Assign to Selection. And that'll apply that material. I could do it to the tanks. So maybe I'll pick those tanks there. And let's find something, maybe they're galvanized. So I'll assign that. And you can see their appearance changed here. So we'd go around and do that to the necessary objects. I do suggest you do as little of this as possible, unless you're looking for that 100% full-blown, realistic view that you're going to share with someone. If it's just for the sake of giving somebody the idea, progress of the project, maybe it's part of the review process, then you don't have to do what an architect would do. But it's fairly simple to add materials. Also, we can add light here if we need to. I do have some lights already added just to save some time. And it's as simple as placing your light and then moving it into position. And you can add as many or as few as you want. These are the different types of lights you can create. Point light is the easiest one and probably the most used if you just need to add light to a scene. Okay, let me switch back to my viewpoint. All right, so those are the things that we need to consider because we don't want to get stuck down this rabbit hole. Now, if we want to do a test render and see what it might look like for someone, we're going to use the ray trace command, and we're going to set it to low quality. I always do low quality for the reasons I just told you, because I don't want to spend a lot of time rendering or waiting on a rendering. I want to get it done and get it shared. So it's, what's the simplest thing that we can get away with. So I'll make sure my setting is low quality, and then I'll start a ray trace, and this might take a few seconds, maybe 20 or 30. But what it's going to do is give you a glimpse of what someone else is going to see, so we can make sure that it's not too dark and as close to the real thing as you need. So as long as there's enough light in the scene, then at least we'll know that they'll be able to see it when you send it to them. Of course, here it looks like I got some shadows. Looks pretty good. We got some reality on the materials. And the nice thing about the Ray Trace tool in Navisworks is that I can stop this at any time. So I don't have to sit and wait for it to finish. Once I see what I need to see, I'll just stop it. But once you get something that looks about like that, where it's lit up enough and it's not, pitch black, you don't want to have to wait on a render and find out that you can't see anything. And then we're ready to share it. Now, to take this to the VR stage, this is when we will do a render in cloud. This will send the processing for the 360-degree view that you're going to get. It takes it off of your computer. That way you can continue working. You don't have to bring your computer to its knees while this is happening. So you would choose Render in Cloud. And if you're not signed in through Navisworks to your Autodesk account, you'll get prompted at this point. So you'll need to sign in. And then we can set up the scene for sharing. Now, if you're going to do a 360 or something that's going to go into goggles, you're either going to use Panorama or Stereo Panorama. You could do still image if you just wanted to show them that shot, and then it renders it very high quality and very quickly. Best part is you don't have to wait for it on your computer, so you can work on other things. If I'm going to share this on the web through a web browser, you would use Panorama. If your end goal is goggles, then you would do Stereo Panorama. Your render quality, you got two choices, standard and final. The standard one is free. The final one might cost a few cloud credits. And this is another one, those that work on more on the architecture side where it's presentation level, they may do a final quality, but that's going to cost some cloud credits. But if you want to keep it free, then leave that set to standard, which is the default, and it will be good enough. The bottom two, I never change these. I always do the default exposure, which is advanced, and leave the width at 1024, but you do have some options there if you want to increase the resolution. If you want to get notified by email when it's finished, you can check this box here, and then you would start rendering. Now here, I'm not going to actually start this one because I don't want you to have to wait on that to finish. So I'm going to show you one that I did yesterday. Oh, and before I switch to this screen, let me show you how I'm getting there. Once the rendering is finished, then you'll click this button right here, Render Gallery, and that'll take you up to here, which is on the web, and you'll sign in with your Autodesk ID here as well, and then you'll see that project here. That's the one for this model here that we're looking at, so we'll view that. And I did do this as a stereo panorama. That way you can look at it in the web browser. You can also send this link out to someone through email or with a QR code, and then they can open this on their phone. And if you have goggles, you put your phone in your goggles, and then you can view this with that method as well. And that's the part, there's no way for me to actually demo that, but if you had a link like this and you had some goggles, then you could take it from there. To share that, we can open rendering on phone, and that will produce a QR code. So I don't know if anyone is ready for this today, but if you happen to have goggles on you, you could use your phone and scan that QR code right off the screen here, and then set your phone in your goggles and take a look. I also did share the hyperlink. I sent it to Casey. So that's another way you could do it. if you're sharing via email. Okay, so this is it is a bit low quality. You know, it's a bit grainy, but I also use the free method to produce it, and I also use lower settings so I wouldn't have to wait very long for this to get finished. So those types of things you want to consider when you are sharing is, you know, how high quality do your people need this to be? And so just keep those things in mind. So that's a little bit about getting your Navisworks model more towards VR. And there's one more topic I've got on my list here, and that is Google Earth. Let me go back to my bird's eye view here. And let's turn those lights off. Okay, so for Google Earth, before we bring Google Earth into the mix here, and before we start to export, I think it's a good idea to hide whatever you're not going to see in Google Earth. And when I think of that, I usually think of everything that's inside the building. So you want to hide those objects first. So to do that, I'm going to use the selection tree again to do all of this. So I want to hide all the plant information. And I also want to hide the structure from the Revit model. So I'll go down inside the building. And I'm just going to look for everything structural here. And we'll hide that. And there's some under the roof too. And then I'll turn the roof back on. So this is where you would have to make that decision, what you're going to show via Google Earth or what's going to be able to be seen from there. So just make sure, whatever the case may be, that you hide whatever you don't need in Google Earth. That'll cut down on the export time and the complexity of the geometry that you'll see in Google Earth. So that's the first thing you'll do. Second, we'll go to the Output tab, and then on the Export Scene panel, Google Earth KML. In order for this to land where it needs to in Google Earth, you have to have the latitude and longitude here. Now I have some coordinates here, but I'm going to switch over to Google Earth and show you how I acquire those first and do a little bit of back and forth. So if you happen to know the latitude and longitude of your proverbial base point, you would enter that here. You can key it in if you want. I prefer to get it from Google Earth first and then import it into Navisworks and then do another export to send the building out. And that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm just going to let this screen sit here and switch over to Google Earth. Now, I do want to, I will confess that I don't use Google Earth a whole lot. And some of you may know a lot more about it than I do. So, so keep that in mind. But the first thing I'm going to do here is I, enter my address, the usual things. I don't even have an address right now, but what I did for today was I just figured to keep it simple and make sure I have a lot of open space to place this building. I'm pretending that this building is supposed to go somewhere in Kansas. And for some reason, this is the city I chose. Now, this is a whole lot easier if you already have your address or have the latitude and longitude. All right, so there's the nearby city. So I'm just going to come out here, way out here in the open. And I like this spot here. It looks like there's nothing there. And I'm going to pretend that that is the site for this building. All right, so what I'll do next is just place a pin. Put that where I need to. I'll just set it about right there. Now this pin is going to be tied to the proverbial 0, 0 from your models. So whether that point comes from Plant 3D or Revit or wherever you are thinking of your 0, 0, that place mark is going to give me the latitude and longitude, and that is going to be tied to your origin. For you Plant 3D users out there, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so you place your pin there. I'll go ahead and name this something useful. And get that pinned in Google Earth. Next, since I want the latitude and longitude, over here in the Places area, you'll right-click and Save Place As, and save that as a KMZ file. Then we can switch back to Navisworks and import the KMZ file. So there it is. And that will capture that latitude and longitude. I did all that because I hate typing and there's too many digits there. And that's the way it is with latitude and longitude. So that's a quick way to get it if you didn't want to, copy and paste those or type them in. So we'll import the KMZ file into Navisworks, and then we'll turn around and hit OK and export your building. And I'm doing that to another KMZ file. So I have one with just the site, and then this one's going to be the site with the building. And I'm probably going to get a warning. Yep. This warning comes up a lot when you're exporting to Google Earth. This has to do with all the viewpoints that I have in my Navisworks file. I'm just going to click OK and move on. I'm not going to use those in Google Earth anyway. All right, so over in Google Earth, all we do is a file open and open up the file that we just exported from Navisworks. Give it a moment and you'll see the building. It does bring in the viewpoints, as you can see by their indicators there. Problem is, we got that warning because if I double click on one of these viewpoints, it may work, it may not. That's not the viewpoint I used, but it's still usable. But it kind of is a crapshoot with these viewpoints. I think Google Earth is trying to pull those in from Navisworks, but most of the time they just look off into space. And so what I normally do here is expand on that file right there, which is your exported file, and just uncheck the views, just so they're not cluttering up things in Google Earth. But that's how you can bring that in from Navisworks into Google Earth. I hope that's enough there. Casey and I didn't discuss, what those of you in the room that asked about this, we didn't discuss, okay, well, once it's in Google Earth, what are you doing with it now? Are you just letting it sit there, or are you doing other things? So this is where I planned on stopping once we got a model into Google Earth. Okay, so there is another product I did want to just mention. I don't think we have time to get into it really, but if you are using Google Earth, because you need to reference the terrain, road work and things like that, if you have one of Autodesk's new collection licenses, you have access to another tool called InfraWorks. So I just want to show that to you just for a moment. It looks like this. This reminds me a lot of Google Earth, except the detail and what you can do in here is beyond what you can do in Google Earth. I still have a site captured here, but here I've got an entire city. Some of these models came from AutoCAD, some came from SketchUp, some came from Revit. But as you can see, the detail that you have on screen now is a whole lot more than what you have in Google Earth. Because Google Earth is still mostly image-based. And yeah, we can bring models in like we just did, but they're still very crude shapes. Here, these are actual buildings, and if they came from the right products, they have information attached to them. So you have that. For example, I can pick on this road here, and it tells me at least what road it is. So if you're using Google Earth and you happen to have, or you upgrade or converted your license possibly to one of the collection licenses, then this product is in the collection and you have access to it. I highly recommend that you take it for a spin at the very least. And at least then you have an alternative to Google Earth. You're not just, stuck with one or the other. So, but that's all I want to do there is just mention it, make sure that you're aware of it. And if we want to get into deeper discussion about it, then we can come back after today and talk about that if you want.